care is a production need and not an emotional extra. I think that's so crucial to really take in, because that changes actually then the whole way we can think about care, which is that actually it should be and can be built into how you produce and how you run production.
This is Rough Cut, your community-driven podcast on navigating the art and practice of nonfiction video storytelling from all of your friends at the Video Consortium.
Hey everyone, my name is Sweta Vohra, and I'm head of production and a producer at Multitude Films. Multitude is a queer and women-led nonfiction production company where we work on stories by and about historically marginalized communities. We think a lot about authorship, who's behind the camera, how do we build creative teams that are reflective of the communities we're covering. And we also think about culture change, narrative change from the very early stages of films. So that is built into how we produce. And I just wanted to shout out and thank and send a thanks to Video Consortium and Brown Girls Doc Mafia for bringing us together and having this conversation, which is really around the Pay Transparency Project and how we think about that alongside ethical producing and ethical productions.
Thanks, Sweta. I am Emma Alpert. I'm the head of people and partnerships at Multitude Films. And in that role, my work is really around focusing on operations and sort of people-focused HR, and also bringing and growing our partnerships and managing our producer apprenticeship program. And I'm excited to talk about pay transparency today with Sweta. I think, like so many things in the realm of HR and operations, pay transparency is both about compliance, and there's sort of this legal component to it. But it's also really about trust and about culture at your organization and at your team. And there are lots of laws that employers have to follow, and they really vary state by state when it comes to pay transparency. And these laws tend to kind of define how norms operate around these issues. And in our industry, I think there's a lot of complexity around pay transparency and a lot of factors that make it even more difficult than normal to talk about compensation and norms around being transparent. But I think at Multitude, we really think about pay transparency as part of a larger whole, part of a values-driven way of doing producing and production that involves transparency and clear communication and ethical production across the board. So implementing pay transparency can be really tricky, and there needs to be sort of thoughtful understanding of team dynamics, of the power dynamics of the different people you're paying, who's making those decisions, how people are involved in those decisions. You need buy-in from the people who are hiring. And it's not just about the policies you have in place, it's actually how you talk to and relate to the people that you're working with. And I think there's a lot of good evidence that shows that pay transparency, when there is more transparency, there's more trust, there's less turnover, employees are happier, they're more productive. And that definitely applies in the film industry. And I do just want to note, in my role, I think a lot about how these questions are relevant to full-time employees. And there actually are some decent standards and protections in place. But when it comes to gig workers and freelancers, there are fewer standards and protections. And I mean, almost none, which is why platforms like the Pay Transparency Project are so important, and having these conversations that encourage people to talk about this stuff with their peers, with other people in their field, and agree to standards that can actually hold companies and employers and the industry as a whole accountable is really essential in order to improve our norms and ways of being around pay transparency. So I want to kick it back to you, Sweta. I think, I'm curious to hear from your perspective as a producer and as head of production at Multitude. How do you think about pay transparency with crew, with the people that you're hiring or working with on productions? And what does it mean to have pay transparency when it comes to our work and philosophy of film producing overall?
So I think one thing I wanted to say from the top is kind of how we think about approaching producing and our, which relates to how we form our budgets and think about all the roles that we're hiring for, is that we are really trying to come from a place of abundance and generosity. Abundance has been thrown out a lot lately in the political conversation, but I just want to say we've been using this for a little while to think about how we approach production. And I'm just gonna hold up a card here. It says abundance versus scarcity, so everyone can understand and underline that point. Which really means that we are trying to build budgets and productions that have robust that are healthy, that really value each of the roles that we're going to bring on for the film, and they also reflect sustainable production schedules. I say all that very with a real clear understanding that the reality of our funding and distribution ecosystem can have real limitations. And so this is not disconnected from reality, and it's a completely alive conversation and something we're thinking about and adjusting, and talking amongst ourselves all the time of how do we continue to build budgets and build productions that are sustainable, that are ethical, while taking into account all the realities that we're in. And I think a distinction I want to make is that we think strategically about how to be economical in our budgets versus when productions and companies are trying to cut cost at every corner. And to me, that means you're sacrificing oftentimes safety, sustainability, the story itself, when you're always trying to kind of trim rates or trim days, shoot days, or, just kind of trying to find all those little corners to cut versus coming in with the mindset that we're going to think strategically about where we can save, but not impact the sustainability and safety of the team and the story itself.
You made a point that, like, when we have a larger budget, we're going to be focusing on trying to give the higher end of what is market rate or what is fair labor rate for particular roles. And I actually don't think that's necessarily the norm. I think that even that is a values driven decision.
Yeah, that's a great point. And also, just to say, like, the budgets we put forth, whether it's to Netflix or to a funder, it is really reflecting the values that we have for the production, for the people we work with. So just to drill down a little bit more on that, it's not just about the line item rate that we're putting into the budget. It's also how many shoot days are we budgeting? How are we budgeting for travel? How do we buffer in time for, in between shoots? These are all things that we're trying to reflect to make sure that there's sustainable schedules, that even when we're, bringing on people at maybe sort of lower range rates, we are still thinking about, okay, what kind of support do they need in the field? So am I budgeting in assistant camera for director of photography? And this is also kind of a live conversation if in the planning of a shoot, if a cinematographer is telling me, actually, in order to achieve what we need to achieve in the shoot, I don't need these lenses, but what I really need is an assistant camera. And so it's in real time understanding, okay, what's the best way we can support these roles? Also, the cinematographer understands what we need to get creatively. And so I'm adjusting these things to better support whatever we need in the field. And so it's not necessarily that it's moving money, but obviously it's all in a budget, it's all there, but it's moving it around to make sure everyone feels supported and that we can gather the material we need and everyone feels engaged. And also it's a sustainable schedule. We're not trying to squeeze 7 days of shooting into 5 days. We're not skipping meals. We're not, scheduling long travel on the days we need to shoot. Like those are all things to take into account when you're building out budgets and building out schedules.
I feel like what you're hitting on is also, the fact that pay and compensation isn't just a monetary value. There's also, if you're an employee, you're looking at things like benefits and PTO and things like that. If you're a freelancer, you're looking at things like, a thoughtful shoot schedule, taking into account accessibility needs, like really giving crew an opportunity, like engaging them in a conversation about like, okay, here's what we can do when it comes to your rate. If that's, lower than what you would want it to be, like, this is our budget, but like we can build in other ways to support you. And that all comes from the idea and the radical idea that workers are like whole people who have various needs. One of the biggest ones being, compensation for their time and labor and energy and skills. But there are also, a myriad of ways to think about what compensation can look like and what a healthy, functional production environment is.
Yeah.
Can you think of any examples of like decisions that you've had to make around, when you had less budget than you wanted to, but were able to compensate people in other ways, or just ways that this has shown up in like a practical sense?
When we were filming Power, which is a film we produced with director Nancy Ford, we did a lot of studio interviews. And so these were big interview setups. And I remember having long conversations with our gaffer and grip, which is, these were big setups, which required a large lighting team. And even though this was a Netflix budget, it was also still like, how do we achieve a look that we need in a still, a modest budget? This wasn't endless money. And so I remember we had to drill down a lot about what kind of equipment could we get, and could they get one more person to support, which is basically called a swing. And we had not budgeted for that role, actually. And I think in deep conversation, we understood, okay, in order to get the interviews we needed to get in the days we had, and to give the time setup we needed, we did need an extra hand. So, there was some other stuff we pulled from in the budget. I mean, all sort of conceptual, but, we were like, okay, we can actually put more towards this set of days because we can see that the lighting team really needs a lot more support. And if we don't, there's like a knock-on effect of actually just trying to still meet our schedule and bring in the people that we needed to interview on time, et cetera. So, that was something that was a real back and forth with the gaffer and grip. But I think they really understood the parameters of the shoot. They were really invested in doing that, and they wanted to make it the best that they could, obviously. So we figured out how to best do that and still not go over budget. I think one thing you had already brought up, which is kind of, in conversation with crew and team when we're hiring, is, okay, maybe, we can't meet a certain rate, but we're going to figure out other ways that we want to make sure they're supported, and what kind of other maybe gear or another supporting role to bring in. But even before that, one of the practices that we have at Multitude is that when we approach people to hire them for any film, that email that I'm writing initially to reach out and ask if they're available has the budgeted rate for that role. I think it's really important just to not put the onus on the person to come to us with the rate. Because as we all know there's various reasons that people might feel scared to give their full rate, or they feel like they really need this job. And so they're going to lower their, what they might need or what they're usually getting, and or they're underestimating their own experience. And we also know this falls on heavily on BIPOC folks, women, trans folks. So that's really something we try to be cognizant of and be upfront about the rate we have. That doesn't mean if we're not going to negotiate at all, but we're really trying to come from a point of like, I'm being transparent about the rate that we have in the budget.
I really appreciate that process because it's also one that acknowledges the power dynamic between the person hiring and the person looking for work. So I think that is a really important thing to drive home for people that are hiring and listening to this discussion, which is, again, like if you're in a position where you can be pushing for more pay transparency, pushing for rates to be shared up front, just really operationalizing that in a way that doesn't put the onus on the employee or the worker. But even in New York, the pay transparency law didn't go into effect until 2023. So it's really only been a few years, and that's just to require people to put a salary range on the job postings that they put out there. So it's like these conversations are so far behind. And I also like definitely want to name that like this is in a lot of ways like a uniquely American issue, or not uniquely, but like the culture in the United States around compensation and money, it's like so loaded and so steeped in like hyper capitalism and like maintaining control that like there's a lot of work to do in this area. And so for people who also have been applying for jobs and are constantly having like really bad experiences with not knowing their pay or having to agree to take a job before the rate is clarified. Like I've heard so many horror stories. Like just know that you're not alone in that. And it's like, again, it's not your fault. It's like, this is a real systemic issue and we have a long way to go.
I think there's this idea of like, oh, people just need to advocate for themselves versus structurally actually changing the way that we do this. And part of this is like to the people who are hiring like us.
In a lot of industries, like there are market rates and there's really good data and research. And I don't think that's the case in our industry, especially in the like documentary corner of the industry. And so curious, like who do you rely on for data to know that the rates that we're offering are competitive or that, that they're fair?
To some extent, it's hard to keep track of the ranges. But I think we are often relying on our trusted relationships with some of the people that we work with a lot, cinematographers, sound folks. I am checking in with people time to time to see like what their range is, what kinds of films, what kinds of rates on what kinds of films are, also features versus shorts versus series, which definitely changes. But also there's two groups that I've been, that we've been paying attention to is the Documentary Cinematography Alliance and BIPOC Doc Editors. Both of those organizations have put out different standards that they'd really like reflected in the industry. That includes, kill fees for cinematographers. That includes production schedules, like actual robust, sustainable edit schedules. And so we have put that into kind of our practices as much as possible. We really strive to meet those standards. And I think sometimes budget constraints don't necessarily allow us to always meet those, but I think it's something we try to be really transparent about from the beginning. And the other thing is like, this is all part of, we have a production manual within Multitude that we have from A to Z listed all our protocols and practices of making films. This is where we take some of those standards that are advocated for. We try to put them into our manual so everyone understands some of the production norms we have. We definitely have meal breaks, which is like not a given on some field productions. Meal breaks that are no later than 6 hours into the shoot day. Our standard break between wrap, the day's end, and to the call time the next morning is 12 hours. So unless there are reasons, based on like what's happening with participants, unfolding events on the ground, unless that can't be met for those reasons, we really try to have a full 12-hour break between the end of a shoot day and the beginning of the next. And one thing also I just want to say around all of this is something where, Emma, you're saying throughout every stage of this, but these are the norms we really try to keep on set. If for any reason there are, again, unfolding events or participants are doing things at kind of odd hours and we can't always meet these, we're going to be really transparent with the crew up front of like, what are the demands that we might have on any particular day. I try to do that from the beginning when we're first reaching out to folks to bring them on board. If we already know that the shoot is going to have, maybe some odd hours, maybe some intense days, and take that into account into the rate, into the hours we're working. But even if that's not possible from the beginning of a shoot, again, it's sort of the live, ongoing kind of conversation adjustment is that I'm trying to be on top of always letting the crew know, hey, this is what's going to be happening tomorrow. What are like any points of discomfort? What are any, what are the ways that if we need to bring in more support tomorrow, if we need another production assistant on board because we really need to get this done, let's talk about that and let me see what I can do.
One of the things that I try to think about with around transparency that's related to pay, but it's not like maybe traditionally thought of as pay transparency, is like timelines for when people will get paid. Because I think that's another thing that it's often taken for granted that like, okay, you're hired and now you're on this job and I control the money and you'll get it when I give it to you. And there aren't great standards for like when pay periods occur and, when people can expect their paycheck, if there's going to be taxes taken out, what that looks like. So we actually have a standard of all of our crew going through a payroll platform. And there are a few different ones. We use media services, but this is something that can feel new to some of the crew that we work with, because there is like a lot of sloppiness when it comes to standards around getting people paid, both around like ethics, but also legalities. And like by doing everything in a structured way through a platform like media services, we're not only able to ensure like, okay, we're compliant as a company, which is important, but we're also able to say to all of our cast and crew, like, this is when you will get paid. This is when your timesheets are due. This is when you can expect, approvals. This goes back to the culture piece around pay transparency, which is like, people are more productive if they're not worrying about when they're going to get paid. People are more creative. People are more engaged. There's a ton of research to support this way of being. And also it's just the right way, like the best way we can be.
You just reminded me of a group call I was on with filmmakers where, it was like a supportive, people were sort of just sharing stories and things they were stressed about. And this person who just had not been paid for weeks and weeks from a big project and was just so distraught, was feeling bad about continuing to follow up, just had kind of lost all like way to figure out how to get that money, and just the knock-on effect that has for them, for all the other work they're trying to do, and also just for sustainable living. I mean, they hadn't gotten paid for this work that they had done weeks and weeks before.
It should be a norm that you're being informed about when you're going to get paid, how you're going to get paid, how much you're going to get paid. But because it's not yet, the onus can be on you to say like, these are the questions I have, because I also know lots of people who are looking for work who I think, as you named, Sweta, like they don't want to ask because they're worried that if they're difficult in any way, that it's going to mean they don't get hired. But like, if we are collectively as workers saying like, before I get hired, I need to know these things, that becomes a norm that, you know, companies have to respond to and productions have to respond to, because like the labor that is making their creative endeavors possible demands it.
So the other thing I think we really wanted to talk about, and that we've already been touching on throughout this conversation, is how we think about care at Multitude. And I certainly have examples to get into, but Emma, maybe you can just share how we're approaching it overall and what we've been really getting into lately and operationalizing it.
At Multitude, you know, we've been around more than 8 years, and part of the foundation of the company was in trying to be disruptive and changing the status quo of how production companies work, and also in particular how they work vis-a-vis their employees and their film participants. And one of those core values that we hold is this value of care, which I think has increasingly become, you know, a bit of a buzzword, and a lot more people are talking about it. And we're really trying to think about what care means in a production sense. So in the last few years, we've been working to operationalize that on our team. And one of the big ways that started was through our approach with producer apprenticeship. And that was sort of acknowledging that there aren't very many pathways for emerging producers, early career producers, particularly BIPOC, women, queer, trans folks, to break into the industry and actually find a pathway to become full-fledged producers, or even find, you know, a career in the film industry. And so this lens of apprenticeship came from the idea that, you know, with mentorship, with opportunities, with a holistic opportunity to become an associate producer or production coordinator on staff, that would be a way that we could help not only support people through professional development and sort of like caring for them beyond what they can give to a production, but actually help them find a pathway into the industry. So that's like one of the big ways that care has manifested on the Multitude team. And then a couple of years ago, we actually decided to bring on a head of care, who is Dr. Camila Oseguera, and she has been with the team. She's a trauma-informed therapist. She's one of the founders of DOG, the Documentary Accountability Working Group. And she really has been able to bring the idea of care beyond just a value that is, you know, written in our production manual or like held up as something we do, and really helped us think about how it's a practice. And so, you know, one of the things that I've taken away from working with Dr. Cam is that, you know, the value of care has to start internally with the team, with the film team, with the production team, from the director and the producer and everyone on the crew. I think we've heard a lot more around care in talking about film participants, because the documentary industry can be so extractive, and lots of people have been harmed by participating in films in ways that they didn't understand when they were agreeing to be in them. But ultimately, you know, if we can't take care of ourselves, and we're not taking care of our staff, and we're not taking care of our crew, then we can't really take care of our participants. And I'd love to hear, you know, from you, Sweta, on how these guidelines have come up, and any specific examples in our productions that you can talk about.
One of the things I've really come away with from working with Dr. Cam and some of the writing that she's done is that, you know, oftentimes I think I have felt this as a producer in my career, where you're trying to meet deadlines, you have really, you know, demanding schedules, you are doing the work kind of elevating justice, and so you think you're already embodying some sort of care, and so to think about care as a whole thing feels like why would you do that? Or how do I have time to think about that? And one thing she really spelled out, which is really helpful to me, is that care is a production need and not an emotional extra. And that has really sat with me deeply. I have this on a card, in fact. Care as a production need and not an emotional extra. I think that's so crucial to really take in, because that changes actually then the whole way we can think about care, which is that actually it should be and can be built into how you produce and how you run production. I want to get into real examples. For Power, which I mentioned before, which is our feature doc on history of policing with director Yancey Ford, and also with our film Life After, which is produced by my colleague Colleen Cassingham and directed by Reed Davenport. Both of these films, Dr. Cam held care consultations with participants. And what these are basically conversations with our participants before and after interviews, maybe before and after certain shoot days. Maybe it's more than an interview. It's maybe some verite. But they are meant to be places for participant to talk directly with Dr. Cam about in preparation for the interview or the shoot. What are their fears? What are they, dreading talking about? How do they want to talk about certain things? What are clear boundaries for them that they want to keep? And this is something they have directly with Dr. Cam. And then usually we have a care consultation after the filming where they can process what happened, kind of think through what felt good, what maybe didn't, how do they sit with this? And I want to be clear that this is something Dr. Cam has also been really clear about with us, that this is not therapy. And this is not to come in to kind of have an ongoing, Dr. Cam is their therapist. It's really built around specifically the film production and how can we support our participants. And I just want to say the takeaway has been that it's been so valued by our participants. I think it has been, regardless of whether they are actually in the final film, to have that space to process something emotional and to be able to share it with people has been really valuable.
So it's interesting to hear you talk about like the very specific ins and outs of how care can show up. And I know, like, for anyone who's been on a documentary shoot or like part of making a documentary, the examples you're giving are probably extremely familiar. One of the, I know, like, particularly contentious things that can come up in the documentary realm, and particularly with film participants, is the idea of paying participants. And since we're talking about pay transparency, it feels relevant to talk about this. And I know it's something that you've worked through in conversation with Dr. Cam. So curious if you can talk about how that's sort of played out for you.
We are really moving towards a norm of participant compensation across all our films at Multitude. There are cases where we will not be able to offer the compensation if we're working with specific partners or distributors. And overall, I would say this is a case-by-case basis. There's not a one size fits all. What I do want to say, though, is what these payments are not is, a sort of a transactional payment for their participation. We're not bringing this up as a way to confirm their participation. And so I just want to be really clear about that. It'll show up in all different kinds of ways depending on the project, but we're not starting the conversation and asking for participation by offering some kind of payment.
We started off this conversation talking about the importance of pay transparency. And I think what transparency is really about is about clear communication. And in the case of what you were just talking about, Sweta, with paying participants, it's not something that we necessarily will do every time. But I think what it holds is acknowledging that the people we're working with, whether they're a participant or crew or staff or whoever it is, should be given the opportunity to have a conversation with us, and we should be leading that conversation by being clear about what the expectations are, whether that's how long they're going to be, involved in this project. Maybe saying, we don't know how long you're going to be involved, but this is what we anticipate, and we want to check in with you along the way. And same with crew, like, this is what you can expect from these shoots. This is what we can pay you. This is what the, care will look like on set. And just acknowledging that, like, pay transparency is one part of a whole, because we want to continue to do this work in a way that's sustainable, not just for ourselves, but for the people whose labor and lives are entangled into these productions. So one of the things we wanted to do in this conversation is really to try to give people a few key takeaways. So Sweta, do you want to talk about your key takeaways?
I would really start with, as someone who's in charge of, as a producer, bringing on crew, reaching out to crew for availability and hiring them, I would really advocate for people to start offering the rate up front, their budgeted rate, and to be transparent about how they came to that rate. The other thing I'd really love to see more of is producers and directors, sharing budgets across the industry. And then what I had said around care as a production need and not an emotional extra.
Completely agree with everything you said. And I think I just want to add one more piece that maybe contradicts a little bit with the first one that you said, but I think both things can be true, which is, if you are working in this industry and if you are the one approaching producers and production companies for jobs, to be clear about what you need. I ultimately I do want to implore people who are in positions of power to lead on this, but also to everyone else out there who is, organizing for work, part of these labor unions, part of these different organizations in the field that are pushing for pay transparency and pushing for fair labor. Keep doing what you're doing, because it does make a difference, and we need both ends to be working to get to where we want to be.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for listening. We really enjoyed having this conversation, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. And I hope everyone can take something from this to their next production, their next film crew role, whatever it might be. And let's keep advocating for pay transparency and care for all of us. And just one more thank you to Video Consortium and Brown Girls Mafia for bringing us together. And hope y'all have a great day.